Okay, this begins the section of our course on identity politics. And by identity politics, what exactly do we mean? Well, there is always kind of being this idea that, in politics, the process of making decision who to support, what issues to support is something that is done fairly on individual basis, right? I think it would be wise for me to support a law that taxes less heavily because I earn a lot of money, right? That might be a decision. I was just giving an example, but that might be a decision making process that you go through, and it allows you to choose which parties you support for, which interest groups you might be part of, based on kind of a very individual decision making process. But what tends to often happen is that people don't really make decisions solely based on the kind of abstract cost benefit analysis. It's not simply about a calculation that they make, but instead what helps inform your decisions for how you feel about issues has a little bit to do with your identity, but your group identity. And that's what we call identity politics. It has to do with maybe your affiliation with a particular group, which might create in you a certain worldview. And this is what we call identity politics. And identity politics is really what underlies this whole idea when we talk about something, a political culture, right? The basic norms for political activity in a society. Political culture, these norms, what is allowed, what is not allowed in society, and so as we talk about two areas where your identity plays a heavy role in what you think about politics and policies in those areas. We are going to be focusing a lot on the issue of integration and national identity. And then in the following week, we are going to talk about religion and politics as a separation of church and state. But I think one of the first thing you want to do, uh, first we talk about identity is um, and when we talk about identity, we really talk about some of the important indicators of identity. What you know when you identify yourself based on something, what are the most likely things that you might identify yourself by? Now, certainly, gender is a big one, but uh, gender is not really that we tend to focus in terms of international politics or differences here that might be from country to country. Obviously there might be different ideas about what gender is from country to country, but it's not something that really aligns along national lines. So instead we are going to be focusing on different indicators of identity. The first one, of course, important to us is being ethnicity. This idea of ethnicity is very similar to the very basic idea of the nation. Maybe the difference might be that there is not necessarily an autonomy claim. When you want to create a nation, you usually want to have some say, right? Whereas with ethnicity, you might just have uh, to set a common language or a name of the people, right? This might be linked to having a common history or certain rituals that you share with other people, symbols that you align behind, thinking about its flag or certain battle that happened in the past. And quite often, it might be linked to either a real or assumed common ancestry, blood ties between people of a common ethnicity. So that's a very common one, ethnicity. If you say something like, "Oh, I am Italian American, and as such, I tend to vote such and such way," that would be an example of identity politics. The second place where our indicators of identity and kind of things that your identity might form around is maybe not your ethnicity, but quite related to it, an aspect of ethnicity for sure would be language. Because language is a place that holds ideas and certain symbols based on what language that you use. It can tell you different things about what you believe yourself as a people. So again, we have talked here. It's very important to have codified your vernacular language that helps crystallize an identity. Maybe a national identity, like we are talking about in the case of British. The absence of having a codified, written down, having an alphabet for vernacular language risks not having that language continued, right? We are not having a strong sense of identity linked with it. Language, again, does not always have to be simply an indicator of one nation versus another nation, but within a single society language can create of classes of haves and have nots based on just how well you speak a language or certain dialect that you might have. In the British case, you may understand Cockney English, right? And that's a delineates your class as well, but it can also really limit your ability um, um, to make maybe work in a bank or something like that. At least it did in the past, and that is known as dysglossia. You know, Dysglossia is when a language is used in a certain job or a certain situation so that those without the language skills, without that proper language skills, face exclusion. And this often happens when you have cases of migrations where people come and they don't master the language as well as the native speakers, right? And the native population creating kind of two different groups within the society based on language. Of course, there can also be division based on what language should be used in a society. Think about in Canada, whether it should be French or English. So, language can be one of these dividing points between uh, groups in a society. The third one is, of course, race. And I've got a kind of generic social scientific definition here. So, phenotypical assigned component of identity rooted in the first meeting between peoples at which a hierarchy of inferior and superior was established. So again, we say phenotypical, we mean on the outside, right? Something that's on outside based on certain differences that one can see with the naked eye. You start to say, well, these two people are different. Why? Well, they may have different colored skin. They may have different shape of nose or lips or eyes, right? Things like that. That's again an interesting thing. You might say, well, that's biological that you are talking about. And to a small extent, it is biological, but frankly, at what point does one then really draw difference, right? And one of the interesting things for people who don't really understand the biological nature of race, such as myself, right, is is when you actually talk to biologists and they can point out to you that, let's say in Africa, right, where people might have superficially looking fairly similar skin color, if you actually get down to genetic level, if you look at the DNA of people in different parts of Africa, they may be closer, Their DNA structure may be closer to somebody living in China and then somebody living only 500 miles north of them in Africa. Although you would then say, well, these people are all African race and those people are of Sino race or Asian race, all right? From a biological point of view, that's often wrong. And it simply comes from judging somebody based on their superficial appearance. On the phenotype, that's what the phenotypical difference means. So again, phenotype doesn't tend to tell us very much. It's not that scientifically accurate if we are really trying to classify people by their difference. Biological difference, and also based on biological difference. And so instead, it's something that you can see and what happens in the first meeting between the people, and we are talking largely here, right? But not always so. Many times, Europeans who came to places like Asia or Africa or the American continent is that they saw these differences and it became a quick opportunity to point out those differences because of wanting to create a sense of hierarchy, saying, well, we are white people and we come here blessed by God because we understand who the true God is, and as such, we expect to be leaders. This property that you have, this land that you have, needs to be shared with us or needs to become ours. And so a lot of this is based on that first meeting, and just kind of one of these groups being rather quick to focus on these outward appearances, and then start to create a sense of hierarchy, and that's how race developed. Another aspect, of course, is religion, and that's what we will be dealing with maybe a little more in next week, right? Although it's a division of church and state that we focus on most, but religion is another indicator of identity, a very special one, because it already automatically seems to create a strong moral dimension of it, right? This idea that based on your religion, it allows certain people to make certain claims about the truth, all right? And that can lead to conflict. You were wrong, I am right, I am enlightened, a heathen, those kind of things can come up. Obviously, we already maybe discussed a little bit how texts and languages play a crucial role in passing along religion, and that sense of identity linked to religion, it often has to happen. It doesn't have to happen, but it often happens through what we call organized religion. Institutionalization, right? Priests and setting out certain kinds of ritual. It's a common way that organized religion is set up. This, of course, also creates sometimes certain question about the role of religion and the state. Right. Sometimes religion can be a competitor for legitimacy in a state, where they say, well, the secular government is not as legitimate as the kingdom of God, right? If you think about Catholicism. But if we see that today, many cases when we are talking about Islam, and another dimension really that comes out of this as well is this idea of fundamentalism, which is a really strong resistance to distinguishing society as something which is public and private, and that religion remains only in private sphere, that there is a public sphere that would be secular. Oftentimes, fundamentalism denies this to be the case and instead would insist that everything is subject to religion, that religion can say something about everything. So, oftentimes, from a fundamentalist point of view, if you are going to go oppose any kind of change